It was May 30th, 1878, and John Harrison, the grandson of former President William Henry Harrison, was at the Medical College of Ohio searching. He was searching for the body of a friend whose grave had been disturbed and whose body had been stolen 10 days previously. Through the help of a Cincinnati detective, they had found out that it had been a delivery to the Medical College of Ohio 3 a.m. the previous morning of something white that was presumed to be a cadaver. They searched the grounds and they made some disturbing discoveries, but they didn't find the body of his friend. And they'd almost given up when they found a hidden trapdoor, underneath which was a taut rope. They pulled it up to find out that it was hanging a human body with a sheet over the head. From the age of the cadaver, Harrison didn't think it could be his friend, but the detective suggested that he look at the face anyway, just to be sure. They pulled back the sheet, and Harrison, to his horror, realized that he recognized the face. "It's father," he gasped. John Scott Harrison had been buried just the previous day, only to have his body snatched and discovered by his own son at a medical school. The body snatching of John Scott Harrison, a former congressman and son of a United States president, represented a macabre practice that had gone on for centuries, but also illustrated the challenges of a new scientific age. It is history that deserves to be remembered. On May 25th, 1878, John Scott Harrison, the only man to be both the son and the father of a U.S. president, died at his home. He was the last surviving child of W.H. Harrison, the 9th President of the United States, although he died a mere 31 days into his tenure. He was buried in Congress Green Cemetery in Ohio, near President Harrison's tomb. While burying the body, John Scott's sons, including future President Benjamin, noticed that the grave of a friend, Augustus Devon, who had died 10 days earlier, looked disturbed. Realizing that their friend's body had been stolen, the aghast men were terrified that the same could happen to their father, and so they took precautions. He was already in a masonry vault, but as an added precaution, they had several large stone slabs, so large that, quote, their weight required the efforts of 16 strong men to overcome, placed atop the casket, and then they had the whole thing sealed in concrete. As a further precaution, they hired a watchman to look over the grave for 30 days. In the mid-19th century, body snatching was common practice. The teams of men, and sometimes women, who stole the bodies were often known as resurrectionists or resurrection men, and had developed sophisticated means of robbing the graves of fresh bodies, which they then sell to medical colleges, who desperately demanded bodies for use in the study of surgery and anatomy. The 19th century was something of a renaissance for American medical science. In 1800, there were only 4 medical colleges in the country, but by 1900, there were more than 160. The growing professionalism and needs of the colleges necessitated demand for bodies to be used for teaching, especially as medical teaching became more focused on anatomy. In 1824, physician Charles Knowlton was arrested for illegal dissection, which he defended by saying, "The value of any art or science should be determined by the tendency it has to increase the happiness or to diminish the misery of mankind." The controversy wasn't new. The conflict between doctors seeking to become more knowledgeable and effective, and the social mores of respecting the dead, repeatedly boiled over dozens of times in the late 18th and 19th centuries. In 1788, a riot known as the Doctors' Riot broke out in New York City over bodies of poor people being stolen, especially from predominantly black cemeteries. Laws such as the Massachusetts Anatomy Act of 1831 sought to strike a balance between the two. In most states, it was legal to dissect the bodies of convicted criminals who had been sentenced to death. But the supply of such bodies was not nearly enough to meet the medical school's demand. The Harrisons had taken every precaution for their beloved father, but the resurrectionists seemed to know how the body had been buried, because they dug at the foot of the grave and burrowed through the brick casing, instead of from the head of the grave, as was the usual strategy. It wasn't uncommon for teams of resurrectionists to have mourners, often women, view the burial to report on the condition of the body and the burial. The watchman was a suspect, but claimed that he'd been spooked in the dark and chosen not to go to the grave at all, although some reports suggest the watchman had fled the city. Though rampant, medical colleges tended to get away with buying bodies from resurrectionists because the bodies were usually of poor, undesirable groups, and it was even sometimes legal to do so. The body snatching of John Scott Harrison received national attention, as both he and the former president were well-liked, and papers as far away as Helena, Montana, and even Dundee, Scotland reported on it. It brought back into terrible focus the horrors of anatomy research that stood in the 19th century. The Harrisons were national figures, with Benjamin standing as a leading Republican in Illinois, recently defeated for a seat in Congress there, and John Scott having served in the House for a time. When John Harrison showed up at the medical school of Ohio armed with a search warrant and accompanied by a police detective, a janitor named J.Q., who was described as obnoxious and protesting, showed them around. They found several disturbing things, including the body of a black woman who they described as being chipped at, a box full of severed limbs, and the body of an infant, but they didn't find any sign of Augustus Devon. It was only when the police detective, a man named Thomas Snellbaker, had the janitor tailed that they discovered the trapdoor with the hidden body. The janitor was arrested, but the faculty of the college quickly put up the $5,000 bail. Carter Harrison discovered the disturbed grave and rushed to deliver the news to John and the searchers in Cincinnati. When they met, Carter and John exchanged the terrible news. First, that the body had been stolen, and then that it had already been discovered. The Ottawa, Illinois Free Trader suggested that the doctors had targeted John Scott specifically to study his sudden death, while the Philadelphia Times expressed the dismay of the nation. Much surprise is expressed that the leading medical college should be caught in desecrating the grave of an honored citizen, and that the faculty had no comment except to say that the discovery was just their luck. The sons of the elder Harrison were in dismay. Carter Harrison was said to have been quite overpowered by the discovery. Dr. Robert Bartholow, dean of the college faculty, expressed his regret that John Scott's body had been taken, but denied any wrongdoing, claiming that the resurrectionist's identity was unknown to the faculty, and that the janitor had no knowledge of the transaction, and that no member of the faculty or students had touched the body. Benjamin wrote an anguished open letter in response. While he lay upon your table, the long white beard, which the hands of infant grandchildren had often stroked in love, was rudely shorn from his face. Have you so little care of your college that an unseen and unknown man may do all this? Benjamin had a source in the form of a Dr. Seeley who claimed to know the identity of the grave robber, but when he was pressed, he clammed up, apparently worried about his own complicity. The Harrisons believed that the college faculty had gotten to the man first. A second search by Benjamin, this time with Pinkerton detectives, turned up his father's clothes, shoved in the building's rafters. This convinced the future president that the college had deliberately hidden the body and that they were hiding their complicity. God keep you from that taste of hell which comes with the discovery of a father's grave robbed and the body hanging by the neck like a dog in the pit of a medical college, he lamented in the paper. The enraged citizens might have repeated the violence of New York's anatomy riots, but Benjamin Harrison was a cautious man who was cognizant of his position as a Hoosier political leader, and he sought to calm them down. Still, he insisted he would use every available means to make sure that the perpetrators were brought to justice, and he initiated both civil and criminal actions. The reburial of John Scott Harrison, as well as the college's protests that the attention was hurting their craft, kept the newspapers and the public frothing. Crowds milled in the alley where Mr. Harrison's body had been dumped, trying to get a look inside, and one paper lamented, "What can we do with the bodies of our loved and lost ones to save them from the ignominy of the shoot and windlass and dissecting knife of the medical college?" News soon broke that the scandal was larger than they imagined. Nearby Miami College, which during the summer was mostly empty during the day, was being used by a man who, among other aliases, used the name Dr. Morton to store corpses which were then being sent all over the area, essentially a clearinghouse for the trade in cadavers. A janitor at Miami College confessed that Dr. Morton had been packing bodies away in the basement of the college all summer and sending them to towns all over the region, packed in barrels labeled Quimby and Company. It was that break that allowed them to finally find the body of Augustus Devon, stored in a vat of brine at the University of Michigan. Real name Charles Morton, the doctor was a medical school dropout who moved and sold hundreds of bodies in the region. He arrived in Cincinnati in March with a blonde woman he called his wife. Told his neighbors he was a doctor and that he loved night fishing, which is why he was gone at all hours of the night. While Devon was reburied on June 16th, a month after he had first been buried, John Scott Harrison was brought to the tomb of a family friend where it would be safe until it would eventually be brought back to its original resting place near his home in North Bend, Ohio, in December of 1879. Detective Snellbaker tried to track down Dr. Morton, but failed to find him. College doctors weren't willing to be forthcoming, with one admitting that anyone who gave the man up would receive the general hatred of all body snatchers and might prevent the university in the future from obtaining an adequate supply of bodies for their studies. The outcomes of the Harrison's court cases are unknown. J.Q. Marshall was not convicted, but it isn't known if Dr. Morton was ever found or charged in connection with the crime. Several civil suits were also filed, but any records of what happened were lost when the Hamilton County Courthouse was burned during the Cincinnati Courthouse riots of 1884. Benjamin Harrison's career skyrocketed during the 1880s, eventually taking him to the White House in 1889. The subject of his father's grave robbing was not something he or the rest of the family cared to recall. He said little of it after the affair was finished. The body snatching of John Scott Harrison led to many important changes. 5 states passed new anatomy laws which both increased the penalty for body snatching but also made it easier for medical schools to obtain unclaimed bodies of people who had died in the care of the state. And while that reduced the demand for illicit bodies, it didn't eliminate it, and the trade continued into the 20th century. The second change affected the nature of burial itself. The Harrison horror inspired a number of inventors to tackle the question of how to make coffins. Inventors in Ohio designed anti-grave robbing coffins, one of which would fire a shotgun-like device, and another which would explode like a landmine if the coffin was breached. While several instances of exploding coffins appear in newspapers and in patent applications, it doesn't appear that these inventions were ever actually installed. More practically, Andrew Van Bibber patented in 1878 the Mort safe, the earliest example of a modern burial vault. The next year, George W. Boyd invented the first burial vault that utilized air sealing to close the vault itself. Today, burial vaults are mostly meant to protect bodies from the elements, but they began their existence protecting bodies from much more nefarious threats. The story of John Scott Harrison's body provides insights into the changing needs and struggles of a society as the Industrial Revolution, the flowering of science, and increased professionalism sought inroads into a nation that was already facing great change. The tug-of-war between the growing demands of science and social mores was further complicated by sluggish government oversight, which struggled to keep up with the pace of change. It's all part of the broader backdrop of the growing pains of an era of enormous societal rearrangement. And we are facing similar challenges in the pace of change today, which is all the more reason that history deserves to be remembered. In 1818, a novel was published anonymously in London that some have described as the first true science fiction novel, and that many have described as one of the most influential novels of all time. Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, created one of the most recognizable characters in horror fiction. But fiction is often animated by a spark of truth, and Frankenstein's monster was truly a creature of its time. Sometimes fiction is history that deserves to be remembered. While the 1818 original edition of Frankenstein was published anonymously, in 1831 a new edition was published under the name of the author, Mary Shelley, although she was still Mary Godwin, just 18 years old at the time that she authored the book. Mary was the daughter of 2 famous British philosophers, Mary Wollstonecraft, a feminist writer and advocate of women's rights, and William Godwin, a philosopher and British radical, although Wollstonecraft died not long after her birth, and she was raised primarily by her father, and later a stepmother. Given her parentage, it's not surprising that she became a writer, as she later explained. As the daughter of 2 persons of distinguished literary celebrity, I should very early in life have thought of writing. While she received little formal education, she was well educated by her father. Sometime between 1812 and 1814, she met Percy Shelley, another radical and famous poet. While married, he was estranged from his wife, and the 2 began an affair, although opposed by both their families. Shelley was a friend of poet George Gordon, Lord Byron, and in the introduction to the 1831 edition of Frankenstein, or the New Prometheus, she explains how the idea of her book came about. In the summer of 1816, we visited Switzerland and became the neighbors of Lord Byron. At first we spent our pleasant hours on the lake or wandering on its shores, and Lord Byron was the only one among us who put his thoughts upon paper. But it proved a wet, ungenial summer, and incessant rain often confined us for days to the house.
In fact, the summer of 1816 was the famous year without a summer, one of the coldest summers on record in Europe owing to the effects of the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora. The dismal summer seems to have put her group, Mary, Percy, Byron, and a doctor named John Polidori, into a dark mood, and they took to reading horror novels from France and Germany. One particular night, she writes, "We will each write a ghost story," said Lord Byron, and his proposition was acceded to. The other three made furtive but incomplete efforts. Byron wrote a poem named Darkness, and Polidori wrote a short story called The Vampire, which some consider to be the first example of vampire fiction. But the winner of the contest was Mary. She wrote, "I busied myself to think of a story to rival those which had excited us to the task, one which would speak to the mysterious fears of our nature and awaken thrilling horror, one to make the reader dread to look around, to curdle the blood and quicken the beatings of the heart. If I did not accomplish these things, my ghost story would be unworthy of its name." That story came to her one night as a waking vision. "I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. Frightful must it be, for supremely frightful would be the effect of any human endeavor to mock the stupendous mechanism of the Creator of the world." Swift as light and as cheering was the idea that broke in upon me. She wrote, "I have found it. What terrified me will terrify others, and I need only describe the spectre which had haunted my midnight pillow. On the morrow I announced that I had thought of a story. I began that day with the words, 'It was a dreary night of November,' making only a transcript of the grim terrors of my waking dream." There are many questions about the famous book. The extent of Shelley's participation is disputed. The two would marry later in the year after his wife died by suicide. The book clearly had much metaphorical meaning, although its politics have been interpreted in different ways. In 2018, BBC Magazine noted, "As a parable, the novel has been used as an argument both for and against slavery and revolution, vivisection and the empire, and as a dialogue between history and progress, religion and atheism. The prefix Franken thrives in the modern lexicon as a byword for any anxiety about science, scientists, and the human body, and has been used to shape worries about the atomic bomb, GM crops, strange foods, stem cell research, and both to characterize and assuage fears about AI. Some have taken Percy as the inspiration for the main character, given his aristocratic background. Others Byron, with whom she was purportedly having an affair. A 2018 edition of the New Yorker writes, "If any man served as an inspiration for Victor Frankenstein, it was Lord Byron, who followed his imagination, indulged his passions, and abandoned his children. He was mad, bad, and dangerous to know," as one of his lovers pronounced. Some have interpreted the monster as an allegory for her own life, growing up without a mother and with a distant father. The most common message, however, taken from the story of the mad doctor who comes to loathe his own creation is the dual theme of warning against hubris and the pain of being alienated from society. BBC Magazine continues, "Frankenstein is simultaneously the first science fiction novel, a gothic horror, a tragic romance, and a parable all sewn into one towering body. Its two central tragedies, one of overreaching and the dangers of playing God, the other of parental abandonment and societal rejection, are as relevant today as ever." But the further question arises. Could the novel that was inspired by the dismal weather of the year without a summer be based on real events? Could Dr. Victor Frankenstein have been a real man? There is an actual Frankenstein castle, today a ruin, along the River Rhine in Hesse. The Franks are a Germanic tribe, and Stein is German for stone. The Frankensteins are a Germanic noble family with origins dating back to the 12th century. Frankenstein Castle, or Burg Frankenstein, is a hilltop castle built in the Odenwald Mountains in the 12th century. The family name Frankenstein was derived from the castle, which presumably represents the stone referred to in the name. Mary Godwin and Percy Shelley spent several weeks touring the Rhine in 1814. The website Romantic Circle says of the tour, "Most of what they saw no longer stands. The devastating Napoleonic and World Wars destroyed a tremendous number of pre-18th century architecture across the continent." While she does not seem to have mentioned ever specifically, many authors have speculated that she must have visited Burg Frankenstein. Moreover, they argue that she most likely heard local legends about a one-time resident of the castle, Johann Conrad Dippel. Dipple was born at the castle in 1673, and the name Frankensteinesis was added as an addendum to his name while he was attending the University of Gießen in Hesse. Using the pseudonym Christianus Democratus, he authored more than 70 books on mathematics, philosophy, and chemistry, but he also dabbled in the occult, studied hermetics, alchemy, and theology. The castle was for a while abandoned by the Frankenstein family after the Reformation, and Dipple occupied the castle in that time. And in many ways, he seemed similar to the mad doctor from the novel. His experiments were considered by some to be sacrilegious, and he was accused by a local priest of grave robbing and performing experiments on cadavers. Further, he is most known for a formula called Dipple's oil, a foul-smelling concoction used in tanning animal hides, but also with purported medicinal qualities. Possibly because of the accusations by the priest, or simply because it did apparently use animal bones and parts, local legends suggest that the potion might have included human body parts. But for more than just tanning hides, Dipple suggested that his oil was an effort to develop a formula for everlasting life, and he attempted to convince the Landgrave of Hesse to deed him the castle in exchange for the formula. Dipple was a real person. His books were real, but exactly what of his work at the time at the castle is legend and what is real is not clear. He eventually left the area. The website Frankenstein's Diaries writes the locals rather chasing him away like those pitchfork-wielding villagers in the Universal Frankenstein movies. The local legend, however, includes him digging up cadavers and experimenting on them in an attempt to create an elixir of life, literally while living in Frankenstein Castle. Given her tour of the area, it's hard not to make the connection that Mary heard those stories from locals and inspired the famous Mad Doctor in the novel. The suggestion has been made by multiple Shelley biographers, but the connections are circumstantial and the assertion still controversial. But it seems almost impossible for it to be a coincidence, having traveled through the area, that the legend so resembles the character in the novel.
In fact, Mary would have had many examples of eccentric occultists and mad scientists that were seeking to conquer age and death on which to base her character. And in fact, she didn't even have to look all the way back to the 17th century to find them.
Studying the generation of electrical current in biological organisms, in 1780, Italian physician, biologist, and physicist Luigi Galvani and his wife discovered that the muscles of a dead frog's legs twitched when brass hooks attached to the frog's spinal cord were touched to an iron railing upon which it was hung. Galvani theorized that these electrical impulses were generated inside organic matter, and he called these impulses animal electricity, and argued that they were an essential spark of life that animated living things. The study of animal electricity became known as galvanism. In fact, what Galvani originally discovered was probably an electric current that came from touching different metals, but there are electrical properties of biological cells, and the study of electrophysiology or galvanism is still a field of medical research. In the late 18th century, however, it was also a matter of curiosity. People would be entertained by demonstrations where scientists would use batteries and electrodes to animate, for example, the tongue of a dead cow. Those studies led to a rather dramatic demonstration by Galvani's nephew, Giovanni Aldini, in 1803. In 1751, Great Britain passed the Murder Act, which was intended to better prevent the horrid crime of murder by, essentially, abusing the corpses of executed murderers.
The act forbade burying prisoners who had been executed for murder, preferring instead public dissection. In essence, in order to further humiliate the murderer, the doctors were given a license to experiment on their corpses. And one such murderer was George Forster, who was executed by hanging after being convicted of murdering his wife and child by drowning them in Paddington Canal.
Some questions have arisen since whether Mr. Forster's trial was fair and whether he actually committed the murders, but convicted he was, and his corpse became the subject of a demonstration at Newgate Prison. The website of chemist Pierre Roberge, called Corrosion Doctors, explains, anatomical dissection was formed part of Foster's death sentence, but no one could have visualized quite the violation that Aldini was going to inflict on him. Before a large medical and general audience, he took a pair of conducting rods linked to a powerful battery and touched the rods to various parts of the body in turn. The results were dramatic. The prison recorded them in its ledger. On the first application of the process to the face, the jaws of the deceased criminal began to quiver, and the adjoining muscles were horribly contorted, and one eye was actually opened. In the subsequent part of the process, the right hand was raised and clenched, and the legs and thighs were set in motion.
And while this demonstration occurred when Mary was just 5 years old, it was fairly well known and not unlikely that she would have heard of it.
The basic idea of the novel, that a process could be devised to reanimate the dead, seemed very much in reach in the era in which Mary wrote her novel. The New Yorker writes, resuscitation of those who appeared to be dead interested many people in the 19th century. As early as the 1760s, humane societies organized by physicians and reformers began to teach the public procedures for reviving the drowned and the suffocated, using smelling salts, vigorously shaking of the body, various methods of artificial respiration, and the application of electrical current. These societies claimed to have saved the lives of thousands of people. American physician David Ramsay sensed the dawn of a new age of medical possibility. How many must have been lost to their friends and their community, he asked in 1801, before mankind was acquainted with the godlike art of restoring suspended animation. In fact, the preface to the original 1818 edition, assumed to have been written by Percy Shelley, starts with the words, "The event on which this fiction is founded has been supposed by Dr. Darwin and some of the physiological writers of Germany as not of impossible occurrence." And her preface in 1831 explains that Byron and Shelley had had a conversation about galvanism the night before her waking vision. That is, the effect of any human endeavor to mock the stupendous mechanism of the creator of the world, that she said would be supremely frightful, was seen as a very real possibility in its time, although Mary never seems to have claimed that any specific person inspired the character of Dr. Frankenstein. Far from outrageous fantasy, BBC Magazine writes, the novel imagined what could happen if people, and in particular overreaching or unhinged scientists, went too far. And further, is there a possibility that there was a real-life inspiration for the monster? Was George Forster the original Frankenstein's monster? Mary's description of the creature coming to life, "I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs," certainly sounded much like the description of Forster during Alvani's experiment. But other authors have suggested a more mundane inspiration. A beggar in Geneva named Noah Burdick, whom she described in her travel diary as sickly, gaunt, abysmally tall, and lacking any human emotion, morality, or sensibilities. Shelley's novels had an enormous impact on culture. Wikipedia lists 76 feature films that featured Frankenstein's monster between 1915 and 2022. These monsters have taken many forms, although few that accurately represent the intelligent and articulate version described in her novel, who taught himself to read. BBC Magazine notes that movies condensed the story into basic archetypes, adding many of the most memorable elements audiences would recognize today, including the comical lab assistant, the line, "It lives!" and a bad-brained monster who doesn't speak.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
We might never know if any of the characters from Frankenstein and New Prometheus were based on a real person, but we know that the life of at least one person was truly written in the story, that of its author, Mary Shelley. The novel was written shortly after the death of her first child, who died in infancy, and by the time she wrote that introduction to the 1831 edition, she had lost 2 more children in infancy and another to miscarriage. And in 1822, she had lost her beloved Percy, who died in a boating accident. In the life of Mary Shelley, Frankenstein, the story of a resurrection gone wrong, finds yet another meaning. That of the agony of the irretrievable loss of one you love. It is Halloween, and skeletons are a common motif on Halloween, whether it be decorations like this, which is surprisingly realistic since it's made out of styrofoam, or skeleton costumes, which are very popular Halloween costumes. A 2019 edition of Time magazine suggests that the connection between Halloween and skeletons might be related to a medieval fascination with skeletons, both from the perspective of developing medical science and from a religious perspective as symbols of death. How a culture views and depicts and disposes of human remains says a lot about its people, but they also might be related to specific historical events. And one unique way of dealing with human remains is an ossuary, which is the deliberate disinterment, collection, and sometimes decorative display of human bones. It might seem a macabre practice to the modern mind, but it's surprisingly common throughout history. It's been used by multiple cultures across multiple continents, from prehistory to surprisingly modern times. The history of displaying our bones deserves to be remembered.
An ossuary represents a unique way of treating human remains, as archaeologist Dennis C. Curry explains. By definition, they are secondary graves, meaning that the remains were initially buried or stored elsewhere and then disinterred or amassed for reburial in a single collective grave. The term itself is derived from the Latin word osso, meaning bone. Writing in a 2015 edition of the journal Archaeology of Eastern North America, Curry, formerly the chief archaeologist for the Maryland Historical Trust, was talking specifically in reference to prehistoric ossuaries along the North American Atlantic coasts, which he describes as a common form of internment practiced during late prehistory, with true ossuaries found as far south as South Carolina and as far north as Cape Cod, as well as among the Huron people in the Great Lakes region. While he can describe the nature of ossuary pits and associated grave objects, Curry notes that even more elusive may be the meaning of ossuaries, although he writes, "We may conjecture." Perhaps, some researchers suggest, the prolonged period of primary internment, followed by communal reburial, allows for a period of mourning on an individual personal basis, followed by an act of closure, which may mark both the end of the mourning period and symbolize the sense of community among the dead. It might also mark the transformation of the skeletal remains from those of a specific individual to those of an anonymous member of a communal group. He notes one researcher speculating that ossuary internment completes the process from physical death to social death. It is only after the ossuary ritual that an individual's spirit is released into the afterlife, and thus finally joining the spirits of its ancestors. However, other researchers suggest that ossuaries had political meaning unique to their time, with one researcher arguing that they reflect the political realities of the chiefdoms that formed just prior to European contact, and that they were part of the process by which native peoples defined themselves as a group, distinct from other groups. While contending that they are still enigmatic, Curry argues that ossuaries may provide a key to understanding early Middle Atlantic societies and help decipher Native American social, political, and belief systems. That conclusion represents a fundamental truth. How we deal with our dead says a lot about who we are. And reburial in an ossuary offers us insights both into human culture and human history. For example, among the earliest ossuaries found are among the Sogdian people, an ancient civilization located in present-day Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. Mazdaism, although more commonly known today as Zoroastrianism, is considered one of the world's oldest organized religions, dating to as far back as the 2nd millennium BC. The website of the Zoroastrianism Heritage Institute explains, a guiding principle of Zoroastrian funerary practices is to prevent rotting flesh from coming into contact with the soil, water, and fire. The environment, land, air, and water, as well as the element of fire, should not be polluted when disposing of a dead body, and the living should not be harmed in any way. Thus, the Smithsonian Institution explains, Sogdians exposed their dead to carrion-eating dogs and birds, and then gathered the bones in ossuaries. However, while the practice was related to the faith, it differed across the culture and across time. Some communities disposed of the bleached and dried bones in communal pits, while others placed them in jars, whose design also varied over space and time as methods of construction changed. Thus, while the governing principles were based in shared religious beliefs, the actual placement of the bones might be related to how egalitarian a particular community was, or whether they thought the rich and the poor should be united in death. The use of the practice is related to both faith and culture and technology. Professor Stephen Fine of Yeshiva University makes a similar conclusion regarding a similar practice in the Second Temple period of Jerusalem. Ancient Jews practiced secondary burial, gathering into bone boxes called ossuaries the bones of their dead a year or so after death, when the flesh had desiccated and fallen off. Fine writes in the journal Biblical Archaeology Review in 2001, the practice continued for approximately 100 years and then disappeared. The problem that has vexed scholars ever since these Jewish ossuaries have become known, Fire explains, is why, for this short period of time, did the Jews of Israel's holiest city, Jerusalem, use ossuaries. The practice developed suddenly, and just as suddenly, stopped. Noting that scholars have traditionally suggested that the practice had to do with preparing the bones for resurrection, Fine argues that this doesn't explain why the practice halted abruptly after the destruction of the temple. Rather, he notes, the period of the use of ossuaries coincided with Herod's massive construction project, rebuilding the temple and the city. The professor postulates that the use of carved stone ossuaries was connected to the growth of the stone carving industry that came with the massive construction process. He writes, when the city was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE, ossuary burial practically stopped. This strongly suggests that Jewish ossuary burial was tied to the culture and prosperity of first century Jerusalem. His conclusion, then, is that the practice was related to historical and economic events which affected both the availability of these stone ossuaries and the perception of a person's place within society. While burial practices are almost always impacted by both culture and religion, they serve practical purposes as well. Ossuaries were often used simply because we needed more space. An April 2022 article on the website of the World Economic Forum notes a recent study that estimates that 109 billion people have lived and died in the last 192,000 years. That's a whole lot of corpses, and it raises a question. What do we do with all those human remains? One reason behind ossuaries is the simple fact that bones take up less space than a whole body. The website Cake, which focuses on end-of-life planning, explains, ossuaries typically hold more than just one person's skeletal remains. Since they only hold bones, a community could inter many more remains in an ossuary than in a cemetery, columbarium, or tomb. This made ossuaries a popular choice throughout history for cities and towns with limited burial space. And that is a big part of the reasoning behind the world's largest and perhaps best-known ossuary, the Paris Catacombs. A March 2014 edition of Smithsonian Magazine writes, as Paris grew into its role as a major European hub, it eventually ran into a major problem. By the 17th century, enough people had lived and died in Paris that its cemeteries were overstuffed with graves to the point where corpses, at times, became uncovered. The conditions finally led King Louis XV to issue an edict in 1763 banning new burials within the city, but those corpses in the already overcrowded cemeteries remained. But the problem finally became untenable in 1780. That year, Smithsonian explains, a prolonged period of spring rain caused a wall around the Les Innocents Cemetery to collapse, spilling rotting corpses into a neighboring property. But the issue of corpses, which are at times literally spilling in through collapsed basement walls, happened to coincide with another issue. The website Big Think explains, sediments left behind by ancient seas created large deposits of limestone in the south of the city, mostly south of the Seine, and gypsum in the north, particularly in the hills of Montmartre and Ménilmontant, highly sought after as building materials. Both have been mined since Roman times. That is, for centuries, while bodies were piling up in Parisian cemeteries, mines were being dug underneath sections of the city for the limestone from which many of its greatest buildings were built. And those abandoned mines are becoming their own problem. Big Think notes. In previous centuries, a road would occasionally open up to swallow a chariot, or even a whole house would disappear down a sinkhole. In 1778, a catastrophic subsidence in Ménilmontant killed 7. In response, Louis XVI created a commission called Inspection Générale des Carrières, or Bureau of Mine Inspection. The commission had the responsibility to map and, where necessary, reinforce the miles of abandoned mines underneath the city. But the problem of abandoned mines meant a solution for the problem of too many dead Parisians. The city's cemeteries were condemned, and the official website of the Paris Catacombs explains, the tombs, common graves, and charnel house were emptied of their bones, which were transported at night to avoid hostile reactions from the Parisian population in the church. The bones were dumped into 2 quarry wells and then distributed and piled into the galleries by the quarry workers. While most new remains were buried in new cemeteries outside the city, some dead were buried directly in the catacombs, with bones deposited there up until 1860. Over time, the remains of between 6 and 7 million people were moved to what became known as the catacombs. But the catacombs were more than just a convenient place to deposit bones. Starting in 1810, the chief inspector directed that the bones be carefully arranged The official website continues. The bones, which had previously been loosely piled, were carefully organized in walls, according to a quarry backfill arrangement. The facade consists of rows of tibia alternating with skulls, and the remaining bones were piled behind the wall. Organized using a museographical and monumental approach, the idea was to make the ossuary a mausoleum that could be visited. The website Offbeat France writes, you'll see plenty of astonishing things. Bones built up into unusual shapes and structures. Signs with names of the streets above. Small rooms with vaults. Rather than the grim and gory scenes you might expect, the bones have been positioned to please, a decision made long ago by then General Inspector of the Quarries, Henry Carr de Thury, who set up the bones as a museum with spectacular architectural structures, such as Doric columns, plaques, altars, and unusually shaped structures, many of which are considered works of art. First opened to the public in 1809, the website notes that displays encourage visitors towards introspection and a meditation on death. Thus, the Paris catacombs represent both the city's history and a place to consider the nature of mortality. While it is undoubtedly a popular attraction, there's particular meaning in making the catacombs, which represent only a small fraction of the mines, a place for visitation. Atlas Obscura explains. Throughout ancient and medieval times, and in the Catholic and Orthodox faiths, displaying and maintaining the bones of the deceased was a way to honor the dead. Honoring the dead in an ossuary has particular meaning in Eastern Orthodox monastic tradition. Theologian Timothy Ware writes in his 1964 book, God and Man, because Orthodox are convinced that the body is sanctified and transfigured together with the soul, they have an immense reverence for the relics of saints. This reverence for relics is not the fruit of ignorance and superstition, but springs from a highly developed theology of the body. The website Orthodox Christian Faith and Life explains that the bodies of Orthodox monks are usually buried for 3 years, and then the remains disinterred. If the flesh is sufficiently rotted away, the bones are cleaned and transferred to an ossuary. As for the empty grave, the website writes, it is now ready to grant rest for another 3 years to somebody else after his repose. The website continues, any inhabitant of the monastery can at any time enter the ossuary and in solitude reflect on the transience of life. Looking at the bones of monks whom he once knew, or those who have reposed a century ago, it is unlikely that one would not come to the thought that they themselves will one day also find rest here, along with their fellow brethren. And some of the most extreme examples of ways to display bones are in the Sedlík's ossuary in the Czech Republic. In 1278, a Cistercian monk went on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land and brought back a bag of earth taken from the site of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He spread the earth across the cemetery of a Cistercian monastery. The website of the Sedlík's ossuary explains, the rumor about his act soon spread out all over the place, and thus Sedlík's became a desired place to be buried. Eventually too desirable, especially following mass deaths due to war and the Black Death. In the 15th century, a church was built with a chapel intended to act as an ossuary. Atlas Obscura writes, there simply wasn't enough room for everyone to rest in peace, and the bodies were moved to a crypt to make room for the newly dead. While the bones were originally organized by what was described as a half-blind monk, the website of the ossuary writes that in 1870, a local woodcarver, Frankenstein, was given the task to decorate the chapel with the bones. 40,000 human bones are now arranged, and the place is now popularly known as the Church of Bones. Atlas Obscura describes the work as some of the world's more macabre art. But what is the purpose of a chandelier made of bones, or a bone coat of arms, especially in a church that still regularly holds services? While the macabre might be what primarily attracts some 450,000 tourists a year, local resident Jerry Sober told CNN in 2019, it's a place where we can go and connect with our family that are no longer with us, a place of rest for those who have died. The Douaumont ossuary in France contrasts with the Church of Bones, a repository for the bones of nearly 130,000 unnamed dead, both French and German, from the World War I Battle of Verdun. Atlas Obscura writes, unlike the neatly stacked piles in the catacombs or in church ossuaries, the bones of the dead soldiers are simply in heaping piles, which strangely feels more appropriate for the violent and tragic way they died, and helps illustrate the sheer scale of death during World War I. Built at the suggestion of the Bishop of Verdun, it took 12 years to build the building in which the ossuary is housed. In addition to the bones, the sanctuary includes engravings of the names of more than 4,000 soldiers who died in the battle. The website French Moments writes, the Catholic prelate had walked the battlefield littered with corpses and wished to give a decent burial to the soldiers and allow their families to gather.
There are ossuaries all over the world. There's an ossuary in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, that displays the skulls of 5,000 people who were killed during the reign of the Khmer Rouge and buried in a mass grave. The government encourages people to visit the memorial so that these atrocities will not be forgotten. Ossuaries serve many purposes. They help us find room in cemeteries. They might represent religious purposes like helping a soul move on to the next stage or reminding us of deeply spiritual principles of things like the afterlife. They help people show respect for and mourn those that they have lost. They remind us of important historical events, and of course each ossuary represents a history of its own. But perhaps most importantly, just like the skeleton decorations that we take out on All Hallows Eve, they remind us that skeletons represent more than death. They are a reminder to make the most of life. They're not just a symbol of the dead, they are also a symbol of hope and rebirth. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop, book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.